I think as we talk about Europe at a crossroads, there are three large-scale assumptions that underpinned perhaps the entire 60 years since the Treaty of Rome, certainly much of the last 20 to 30 years, even during the crisis, which are now no longer to be taken as assumptions. The first was that you could achieve convergence through monetary union. Especially here in the Österreichische Nationalbank and in this audience, I don't need to go into great detail on that. That is, of course, a major intellectual debate as well as a real-world debate. For what it's worth, I was an early advocate of the view that monetary policy and monetary union, while good on their own terms, were unlikely to induce convergence. I gave a lecture in Frankfurt in 1998 on that topic. I wrote things, again, doesn't matter what I wrote, but just to illustrate. At the time, it was very popular. There was a field of political economy being led by people like Posen and Tabellini, for those of you who are into this academic literature. And it was very much, whether it was influential on European development or whether it reflected the spirit of the times of European development, is something intellectual historians can look at. But it was essentially the idea that whether it was central bank independence or fiscal rules or monetary union, that if you imposed the right institutions, you would change fundamentally the performance and the behavior of economies and populaces. And as I put it at the time in '98 and in a subsequent article I published, I don't think that you can simply take olive trees to Sweden and expect them to grow, or plan to catch herring off the coast of Puglia. Some things are fixed. That's not a chronicle for a forecast of despair, and nor is it an attack on the euro. It's simply that there was a great deal of hope passed on the idea that monetary union would induce significant convergence, and that turned out not to be true, and some of us expected that not to be true. The second assumption that, again, I think was intellectually valid and certainly was nobly motivated, but we've learned in the US, or should have learned from the US long before, also is a problem, is the assumption that you could transcend regionalism or even localism, that you could try through the European ideals, which I fully support, to create a loyalty and an identity that transcended the ethno-national local identities. And of course, Vienna, sitting here in southeastern Europe and very aware, and the wiiw tracking what goes on so well in the Balkans and true Eastern Europe, knows how strong some of these identities can be, whatever the economic irrationality, whatever the seeming lack of need. Again, I'm not counseling despair. I am merely saying that we have to, going forward, take this into account. And I think it's important here to draw from US history. If you look at how the Americans voted for Mr. Trump, now President Trump, and you look at how Americans have voted in national presidential elections for the last arguably 150 years, it is still largely defined by the extent of enslavement of African Americans and what role the white population had in 1870. The largest predictor of voting patterns, along with education, which is a multicollinear here, folks, which overlaps, is essentially how many slaves were in a district if you go back to 150 years. Now, that doesn't explain everything, certainly, but it goes with the previous point about non-convergence in the economic sense, that Alabama and West Virginia are still Alabama and West Virginia. Massachusetts and California are still very distinct from those places, economically, but also politically. And that is within the US, where, of course, we did have a civil war and such divisions are settled. The third assumption, which hadn't really changed until very recently, but may indeed be the longest lasting change. I hope it is the only lasting change. I don't want this, but it's unavoidable, that Mr. Trump may be able to instill, which is that one can no longer, just checking time, one can no longer count on U.S. alliance with absolute certainty. I am hopeful, perhaps confident, that the U.S., I won't use exactly the words President Svoboda used, but the U.S. attacks on Europe, the U.S. government's attacks on Europe, excuse me, the Trump administration attacks on Europe, and distancing from NATO are temporary, just as some of the crazy things the president has said about nuclear weapons in Korea and Japan are temporary. We hope these are temporary aberrations. But it is impossible for responsible governments and peoples in Western Europe to sort of go on and say, particularly in Germany, to go on and say, well, we can just forget about it and assume that the Cold War stays where it was, especially given, as President Svoboda rightly notes, the role of Mr. Putin. So that all sounds pretty bad. No automatic convergence, regionalism, if not racism, persists. U.S. security guarantee is probably going to be going forward, but Europe has to do a little more self-insurance than they used to. Okay, how do we go forward from there? I think I and my claque of cosmopolitan elites that President Svoboda invoked, and I hope you consider yourself a member of the cosmopolitan elite. I know the history of the word cosmopolitan in Europe, and I'm actually proud to be cosmopolitan, even though it gets me a target sometimes. When we speak about cosmopolitan elites, I think we got intellectually lazy because of these assumptions. You know, we got caught up in the monetary union project for good reason. We got caught up in thinking that the European ideal would, over time, create cohesion. And of course, we did not question the American security commitment on either side of the Atlantic. But I think there were also two other factors. One was, there's a side effect of having peace. Always better to have peace than anything else. But there's a side effect of having peace that you don't have debt repudiations and you don't have overthrows of constitutions. So when we look at the Western world, the US Constitution gets amended occasionally, but really the last severe set of amendments, except for women's rights, were in the aftermath of the Civil War. You look at France, and the Fifth Republic comes in the aftermath of the Algerian fiasco and at the near coup. Obviously, the Basic Law in Germany, the post-war developments in Austria, in the Netherlands, elsewhere, all took place against the background of the previous war. Again, peace is good. This is a price certainly worth paying. But what it means is you have institutions that don't necessarily adapt to the alignment of interests that are present today. They overprivilege old interests who are the incumbents from when the constitutions were written, which is particularly the case in the US, if you look at the apportionment of who gets votes in the Congress and so on. So what do you do if those are the realities of the world? I think it's important, therefore, to look at US history and realize that it has not been one linear progressive path, even though many of us in the cosmopolitan elite like to think that racism was continually being eroded, education was continually going up, urbanization and integration were continuing. And im Großen und Ganzen, that was true, but not completely. A very great political scientist who's now known for other works, Samuel Huntington, wrote a book, God, it would have been in the 80s, called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony. And he wrote about what he called the IVI gap, that there was an ongoing conflict in the US between the ideals and the institutions, and that you would have not formal cycles, but you would have recurring bouts of disappointment and reaction. And Sam, I actually was his research assistant in college long ago, which is partly why I'm a bad economist. Sam, like many people of his generation, was reacting to the 68ers and in Europe and the Vietnam protests in the US and civil rights protests in the US. And so, but of course that ultimately, we could tell ourselves the tale, I think rightly, that ultimately produced good outcomes in Europe and in the US. The question is, well, can we look beyond the recurrence of this cycle, the hopefully temporary, or can we make temporary the period of reaction? So I see people looking at their watches. I hope I'm not being too boring here. Let me now turn to what is the positive agenda if we take this view. So the first thing that has to be done is some fundamental philosophical view, which is one needs to change the technocratic impetus. I say change, not remove. So Professor Dr. Sterer mentioned the idea, which I think is a very real question, who is legitimate? If we're going to do further integration, if we're going to do further European efforts, who can legitimately put that forward? And what I mean about the technocratic impulse is it's time to forget about the word legitimate. There is this hopeful belief, and I see Carl Eginger in the front row, that we need to fix things by being more responsive to democracy, more responsive to people's claims, more responsive to interest groups, more transparent, on and on and on. I am old enough to remember from when I first lived in Europe, now 25 years ago, the talk about subsidiarity at the time. I mean, obviously Professor Svoboda's been through many of these cycles. But the fact is, democratic legitimacy remains something of an oxymoron. If we look at the recent referenda, this is, I think, in a sense, the most interesting thing about Brexit. It's otherwise just sort of tawdry and sad. But if you look at the recent referenda, for example, Brexit, was there any meaningful conscious vote that really was embodied in that question? Does it really matter that it was on that particular day, at that particular moment, 52% for and 48% against? How does one think about it when so little turnout from the youth were there, even though the youth polled, and increasingly subsequently polled, totally for staying in the European Union? You look at the US, where Mr. Trump arguably won the election for a variety of reasons. It's overdetermined, as we say in social science, but there's increasing reason to think that the particular announcements made by the FBI director on a particular set of dates ahead of the election had a very meaningful impact. We just noted the passing of the great economist Ken Arrow, and the one piece of his work that has made its way into the popular culture and deserves to have is the impossibility theorem, that if it turns out you're trying to do social choice and you have anything other than a straight binary choice, or people have multidimensional choice, mathematically it's impossible to come up with a voting rule that legitimately represents the choice. I am obviously not standing up here and saying, down with the people, up with Brussels. That would be unpopular even for me. What I am suggesting is the technocrats and the leaders have to be more like, frankly, the Trumpers or the Briggs of Tears. If you've got power, run with it. Go back to the old-fashioned view of democracy. If you lose the next election because you didn't deliver, then you're out. But while you're in, take it for everything you've got. And not only take it for everything you've got, take it for everything you've got with a mindset to making sure you don't lose the next election. Now again, that has echoes of Erdogan. That even has echoes of the early days of the Bolsheviks in Russia, and that's not an accident. It's not an accident that Mr. Bannon, Trump's astonishingly influential advisor, basically calls himself a Leninist, that he wants to engage in democratic centralism. I'm not so sure about the democratic part. But you know, this is where I think we have to go. The fact remains there is power at Brussels. The fact remains that in Austria, thank God, the people of Austria voted a majority against the fascists. The fact remains that we will get what's called a midterm election in the US and the Congress in 2018. So if you do go with the fact that the people who have power and have liberal values should be activists and should not tie themselves into knots for legitimacy, but have the realities that people are not going to overnight follow them and are certainly not going to give up their identities and not going to have convergence, what should you do? So finally, I come to the economic and political economy policies. I have a top 10 list. This is, how do you build a European state without a nation? How do you build more of a European state without invoking subject nationalism? And again, it has to be in the spirit of you are playing not to institutions that will transform the way people think, you don't expect that, not to institutions that will cause convergence in the short term, because you can't expect that, but that do consolidate the interests that currently exist and advance the ideals you want. So my top 10 list. First, given the likely nasty things that the US government under Trump is going to be doing, and including starting this week with the expected enormous rollback of environmental and energy rules, basically the EU and China should give the US 2 years. And they can say this publicly or not, but they should basically be coordinating that you have 2 years to come to your senses, whether that's adult supervision being brought in to the White House and to the policies, or a sufficient rise up from the population against the government that the Republicans lose the majority in the Congress in the midterm election. That's about 2 years from now. And if you don't have that, then it is time for the EU and China to aggressively come together on trade and environmental issues and strike back against the US. And there are a number of specifics we can talk about. In a sense, the thing that I would think would make most sense would be putting up a set of carbon taxes and tariffs on countries that try to export to you who do not have their own comparable carbon taxes. Secondly, part of state building, unfortunately, is about having an enemy and usually mounting a national defense. If we look at the 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, that's how states are built. So Europe has to take the reality that the US security guarantee has been made a little less real, that the Russian government under Mr. Putin has become definitely more aggressive, and frankly spend on defense and try to build transnational, pan-European defense institutions beyond what already exists. And again, you can say, what's the legitimacy? But the flip side of that is conscription has never been popular in any society. I'm not saying you have to go to conscription, but I'm just saying that, you look at European history, you look at American history, it never is popular to do this, but countries and governments manage to do it. And so again, I'm not calling for conscription, I'm not calling for a standing European army, but I am calling for a meaningful commitment to European defense, not because President Trump is saying stupid things to Chancellor Merkel about burden sharing, but because the reality is Europe needs it and you can use it to help build a European identity. Third, the US, like the UK, is in the process of throwing away all the soft power, as Joe Nye would put it, that it accumulated over the last several decades. The US is about to start banning foreign students, pretty much in the way that the UK stupidly did. That's one symbol, there will be many others. This means Eurovision is no longer a joke. This means that there is a huge vacuum for Western European, Eastern European, trans-European culture to fill because, frankly, even in Asia, the Chinese dream is not an attractive soft power dream, and for linguistic reasons as well as political reasons, it is not attractive, accessible to normal people, even in Asia, let alone the rest of the world. So if Europe wants to, we used to make fun of French and other efforts to subsidize the film industry and all these things, but Hollywood is going to lose. Putting it simply, it's time for Europe to make Eurovision 3D and just take over. Fourth, getting one notch more economic and one notch more detailed and serious. One major change that Europe is going to have to make, particularly Western Europe, rich Europe, is going to have to make is you're going to have to accept formalization of a two-tier labor market. This is, of course, very controversial, very difficult given where the post-war consensus was built, but picking up on some things both Governor Novotny and especially President Svoboda said, although of course they are not advocating what I'm advocating, the migration issue isn't going to go away. And I don't mean it's not going to go away politically. I mean the people are going to keep coming. There will be some variation with how bad the turmoil is in Middle East and North Africa. There will be some variation depending on the weather and the season. There might even be a little bit of variation depending on if you take me seriously in national security, you start helping the Greeks and the Italians police the Med. But the bottom line is the people will keep coming. And the economic argument in an aging Europe, I don't need to recap for this audience, is profound. But as people in the Netherlands and Sweden and Austria and other places in Europe have found, again, the convergence issue writ large also fits at the individual worker level. Even, you don't need to demonize a poor person coming from Syria or wherever to recognize that they probably do not have the productivity levels and training to march right in to an Austrian manufacturing plant and do this. I think you just have to recognize that because this is a multi-decade process, perhaps a generational process to get those people up to standard. And so you do have to take seriously the idea of having a two-tier work market of a sub-minimum wage or a different minimum wage for people in low-skilled jobs. It is not an ideal, but it may be the best option. And again, looking at lessons from US realities and mistakes, you know, we have this sad reality in the US that there is an enormous informal labor market, which is overwhelmingly Latin Americans, both legal and non-legal migrants. And that exists. And if Mr. Trump puts up the border wall or does the effective equivalent with aggressive policing, that market doesn't go away. Simply those people become even more scared, less able to bargain, have less wage advantages. And the same is largely true in Europe. So whatever people say about migration, and opinions about migration go up and down, and I can't dismiss that with one hand, but you should not feel hesitant about forcing through things that are unpopular on this way, because ethically and economically, pushing hard to integrate migrants is the right thing to do. Fifth, as a complement to creating the two-tier labor market, the biggest form of structural reform I think Europe has to undertake in economic terms is service market liberalization. That remains, even where there is free movement of labor, as is true in the US, much more regulated, much more constrained. The potential gains from service market liberalization in Central Europe, including Germany and Austria, are very large. And politically, again, I would defer to President Svoboda and others in this room who have more of a political nous than I do, but politically there's something to be said for making the lawyers and the bankers and the economics professors have to compete globally and accept migrants and accept cross-border competition if we're asking the poor people to do that. Now again, I don't want to suggest there's been none of that in Europe. There certainly has been some. But we look at the US and this becomes a very real issue. It's interesting, my colleague Jason Furman, who's joined the Peterson Institute, was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama. And while he was chair of the CEA, he put out some research and reports on the problems of occupational licensing, that these essentially were barriers to entry, that they were divided up among the US states in various ways, that these were hugely privileging of mostly white middle class, upper middle class incumbents, and interfered with free labor mobility across the US. And people, Democrats were a little surprised he did this, and libertarian Republicans, like friends at the Cato Institute, were pleasantly surprised he spoke about this. But I think it's another example of where the right kind of structural reform can happen that is integrationist in a real way, is popular, and is doable. Sixth, subheading under services liberalization, get the bankers. One of the sad things, which my friend and who all of us read, Martin Wolf, has I think been right about writing in recent years, is if the US in particular, but also in Western Europe, there had been proper prosecution of financial sector malfeasance and at least some more visible change and turnover of what happened in the banking sector. I don't mean show trials. There was plenty of reason to do it. Some of the political grounds for fascism would have been undercut. It's not too late for Europe to do this in economic terms by breaking down some of the cross-border barriers to bank integration and bank takeover and recapitalization. Again, Europe is making real progress here. We have the single supervisory mechanism. We have various things underway. My colleague Nicolas Varron, who splits his time between Bruegel and Peterson, has written about this. I mean, there's definitely progress, but it is not unreasonable for the leadership of Europe and the leadership of the member countries of Europe to be a little more out there and graphic, that this is partly about teaching the bankers a proper lesson and putting them in their proper place. 7, I want to pick up on what I didn't know he was going to say it, although I'm not surprised. I want to pick up on what President Savvatna said about public investment. Private investment as well, of course. It is shocking to see the underinvestment in Europe, even in the economically successful parts of Europe over the last decade. However, to be fair, one has to look around and see that there was a huge underperformance of investment, or under-provision, I should say, not underperformance, under-provision of both private and public sector investment in the US, of constructive investment in the UK, in Japan. It's clearly not uniquely a European problem. And that's a whole discussion for another day that I would love to engage with you. But just to say, as the years go by and all the rich countries are showing symptoms of the same thing, the kind of arguments that Professor Robert Gordon of Northwestern has made and others that there's some fundamental downshift in technological progress we may not understand, take credence. If there was more variation across countries and across regions in the amount of investment, and there was more pickup across countries and across regions in response to low interest rates and growth of investment, you would fear less that it's some fundamental technological force. Nonetheless, whatever that technological force is, there is still room to improve investment, particularly on the public side. And so we have all these various attempts with the European Investment Bank and Juncker Plan number 8B and God knows what else to try to stimulate investment in Europe. And again, I can't sanctimoniously say, well, just do it, because we look at the US, and in contrast to what decades of political economy would tell us, people both in Europe and in the US in elected office seem to be reluctant to engage in public investment. And you know, all our political science models or economic versions of political science models assume that politicians love this. They can build a bridge, they can build a school, they can stand there and say, ha, that's mine, give me your vote. And for whatever reason, that's not working. And it's not because we don't have liquidity, and it's not because we don't have low interest rates, and it's not because bridges aren't falling apart that we want to fix. So how do we do this? I think one issue which a number of people have been speaking out on, including the no longer Eurogroup chair, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, but also my friend Pier Carlo Padoan, the finance minister of Italy, is there is provision in the European treaties, in the Stability and Growth Pact, to essentially tie public investment to structural reforms, that you can loosen temporarily the budget limits in the SGP if somebody's doing, say, a labor market reform that in the short term will likely be costly, will cause disruption, and you can compensate by expanding the budget limits. I believe this to be exactly the right way to go. I think it can be retweaked and done on a larger scale, but I just want to endorse this movement within Europe, and I know there are people at the Commission working on this, and I think this is a very good avenue to go. Almost done. Eighth, I think the EU has to rethink the idea of the convergence funds. And this, there are a couple reasons for this. The first is, as I mentioned already, convergence isn't happening. Now again, that's an overstatement. As the WIIW, or for that matter the EBRD, has shown, there is a lot of convergence in Eastern Europe, at least in parts. And we can all go to Spain especially, and to a lesser degree Portugal and Greece, and see the manifold benefits of European Union membership, Euro membership, and bridges, schools, dams, everything thanks to convergence funds. Nonetheless, the returns on this politically or economically have not been as close as anywhere near as large as I think they were hoped to be. The second reason I think we need to rethink the convergence funds has to do with a form of moral hazard that is very problematic in both the US and in Europe, but which doesn't get talked about very much, which is, if you have a declining community, a poor community, a community that's deindustrializing, so in the UK it was Wales, for example. I'm not going to pick a non-UK example because then I'll annoy somebody in here, whereas if I pick on the UK, nobody cares. So Wales. And the coal mines in Wales ceased to be terribly useful decades ago, and the technology for extracting coal improved decades ago, and so there are no jobs in the coal mines anymore, or very few. The same can be said of Kentucky and West Virginia and parts of Ohio in the US. And clearly there is a problem, because when that shuts down, when a community is heavily dependent, to state the obvious, is heavily dependent on a given industry, even a backwards, dirty one, it drags down everything in the community. It drags down the tax base. It drags down the inflow of people. It encourages younger people to leave who have higher skills. It reduces real estate values. All true. But of course, the moral hazard is if you put money into that community again, you are discouraging those people from having to move and having to adapt and having to change. And for all my being considered loony left in the US, which makes me center right in Europe, if at some point you believe in the market economy, this is a real form of moral hazard. And this, again, has a very pernicious political effect, because then you have, be it coal miners or steel workers or whoever, who sit there and basically have to become, to the degree it's motivated by something other than racism, have to become forces for reaction, because that is their economic way out. They have to insist, oh, if only you could bring back the coal jobs to Kentucky or to Wales or to North Rhine-Westphalia or wherever the hell. And this is what I meant earlier about the technocrats have to not only try to do the right thing and ignore the short-term democratic forces until they get turned over in their regular term, but that you have to think about the next election. That you cannot, as much as your heart may bleed for Wales or Kentucky or for wherever, you are sowing the seeds of not only unsustainable bad economics, but unsustainable bad politics if you keep bribing these people to stay where they are. It is terrible moral hazard. The US had to confront this and did a very bad job of this when the big hurricane hit New Orleans, for example. New Orleans has it's a lovely place, the food is wonderful, has no business really existing. It is a huge swamp that unbelievably aggressive engineering works have kept it from falling into the sea before. So we had this huge hurricane, and a couple million people were at least temporarily displaced. And so, of course, what happened was all the poor African Americans, I shouldn't say all, predominantly the poor African Americans who are used to being displaced and do not have the political clout, they got up and moved. And so there are hundreds of thousands of poor African Americans from New Orleans who have moved elsewhere in Louisiana to Houston, which is a booming metropolis in Texas, short distance away, other parts of the US. And a certain number of politically entrenched African Americans and the white people in New Orleans all came back and got federal funds. I'm not saying they're living on the dole and everything's wonderful. It's not. But the US had a choice at that point to stop providing classic moral hazard. You don't keep rebuilding in a floodplain. And we didn't do the right thing. And so you just entrench, again, this reactionary thing. It's a clear example. So convergence funds need to be rethought. I'm actually going to cut the list back to those 8. I'm not sure about my 9th on second thought. Let me just end with the following. Technocracy likes to believe that if we do the right thing, the benefits will become evident quickly and that we will therefore be vindicated and politically supported. And technocracy, I mean pundits like me, I mean the people in Brussels, I mean many of the people in this room, WIIW included. But as Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out, I'm going to mangle the quote. If I write this up, I will get the quote right. But the arc of justice goes very long and doesn't bend just one way. You cannot count on the fact that doing the right thing will get you the political support you need, or that even if it's doing something good, will show sufficient results in the short term. And the fiction, the fantasy, the understandable intellectual game that was played to justify a lot of Europe in what I call the Italian school of political economy, that motivated all that if we build the institutions, there will be convergence, people will like it, all will get better, was too optimistic, too facile, assumed too much commonality across regions, across people, and too little stickiness in how the economies work. So the alternative as a future for the EU has to be not tailoring back the ideals, not opening up democracy more so that Europe can be forced to deviate from the values which it should have. It's got to be more realistic, sort of medium targets of institutions that reshuffle the interests, advance economics, but don't presume that you're going to achieve fast convergence or quick buy-in. And I've given 8 examples of ways in which I think Europe can move forward and do that. Thank you very much for your time.